Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, our today's discussion is about next most important topic, collective security system under the United Nations, with special reference to Korean War. First of all, I explain you about the concept of collective security. World peace has always been a serious problem for mankind. Peace and security also remained most important aspect in the history of international relations, in the history of international organization, and in the history of state relations. Collective security, the concept of collective security can be defined in different ways, in different meanings. In a very simple way, we can define collective security. Collective security is an arrangement among states in which all promise in the event of if any member of the system engages in certain against another member to come to the latter's assistance. Next most important definition of collective security by George Schwarzen. According to George Schwarzen, collective security is a machinery for joint action in order to prevent or counter any attack against an established international order. So, collective security may be explained as a collective action against insecurity, against threatening situation. So overall, we can understand concept and basic spirit of collective security as a collective action against aggressor state. In the preamble of the United Nations Charter, it has been clearly explained to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war, which in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and or for this end to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. So it is very clear that United Nations Charter and United Nations Charter's different provisions highlighted importance of maintenance of peace and security for the system of collective security. Next important point that it is one of the purposes of the United Nations, according to the article number 1, to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats and the suppression of actions of aggression or other breach of peace, and to bring out by peaceful means and in conformity with the principle of justice in international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situation which might lead to a breach of peace. Next important point related to the collective security system, that collective security is one of the principles of United Nations that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So, United Nations and United Nations members shall give United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the Charter, and shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United Nations is taking preventive or enforcement action. So, United Nations Charter clearly explained about the collective measures. And during this discussion, the Charter also provides pacific settlement of disputes and its methods. The Charter provides that parties to any dispute, the continuance of which is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, shall first of all seek a solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and resort to regional organization or arrangements or the other peaceful means of their own choice. So, it is very clear and it is very important point that Charter of the United Nations clearly specify the pacific settlement of disputes through negotiations, through inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and through regional arrangements or regional organization or other peaceful means of the choice of states. It is further provided that the Security Council shall, when it deems necessary, call upon the parties to settle their disputes by such means. It is further provided that if the Security Council deems that the continuance of any dispute is in fact likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, then it shall decide whether to take action under Article 36 or to recommend such terms of settlement as it may consider appropriate under Article number 37. Next important point regarding the collective security system, binding effect of Security Council decisions. Members of the United Nations have agreed to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Next point, enforcement or preventive action. Chapter number 7 of the Charter deals with the enforcement or preventive action and is not important chapter which builds a system of collective security and Some important provisions under the chapter of 7 are: number 1, any action to be taken under chapter 7, it is necessary that Security Council should first determine the existence of any threat of peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression. It is only after the Security Council has determined that a breach of peace or an act of aggression has taken place, then it may make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken to maintain or to resort international peace and security. Next, the Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed forces are to be employed to give effect to its decisions, and it may call upon the members of the United Nations to apply such measures, which may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations and rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication, and severance of diplomatic relations. So, in this point, I explained you that severance of diplomatic relations and all means of communications become helpful for any collective action. Next, in case the measures taken by the Security Council under Article 41 mentioned above proved to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or to resort international peace and security. Such actions may include demonstration, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the members of United Nations. This is the most important provision of the Charter of the United Nations so far as the collective security is concerned, because it empowers the Security Council to use even armed forces for the maintenance of peace and security. As I have earlier explained you that the members have agreed to accept and carry out the decision of the Security Council. Thus, it is through these collective measures under this provision the system of collective security has been made very effective. It is further provided in the Charter that the members are under obligation to make available to the Security Council on its call and in accordance with the special agreements, armed forces assistance, and facilities for the performance of maintaining international peace and security. It is unfortunate that the provisions under this article have not been implemented. Next point, Charter of the United Nations and Security Council also further provided that there shall be a military staff committee to advise and assist the Security Council's military requirements for the maintenance of international peace and security, the employment and command of forces placed as its disposal, the regulation of armament and possible disarmament. It may be noted here that since special agreements under the Article 43 for the availability of armed forces could not be made, this provision has also not been implemented and has become more or less defunct provisions. Next, it is further provided in the Charter that the members of the United Nations shall join in affording mutual assistance in carrying out the measures decided upon by the Security Council. Next, individual and collective self-defense. Next, this next point is very, very important regarding this discussion. And point is individual and collective self-defense. The Charter of the United Nations under Article 51 confirms inherent right of individual or collective self-defense upon the members of the United Nations. As pointed out by the different writers, that the right of individual and collective self-defense is, however, subject to certain conditions. For example, if an armed attack takes place, the right exists until Security Council takes any action. It should be reported to the Security Council. It is subject to the review by the Security Council. This right cannot affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. This right is limited to the members of the United Nations and is not available to the non-members. So, it is clear from the above provisions which I explained you that the framers of the Charter tried their best to equip the United Nations with a formidable system of collective security. So, as far as constitutional provisions of the United Nations are concerned, it need not be overemphasized that if they were properly implemented, the United Nations might have a formidable system of collective security. But because of conflict and non-cooperation among the major powers, many important provisions of the United Nations Charter become less effective. So, role of major powers, role of 5 permanent powers of the Security Council is very important to maintain international peace and security, and also for the successfulness of collective security system of the United Nations. Next most important point, it may be noted here that there is difference between collective security and collective self-defense. As pointed out by different writers, that collective security differs from collective self-defense insofar as enforcement action taken by a Security Council under Chapter 7 is the intended reaction against the breach of peace committed through an act of aggression, whereas the use of force in self-defense is intended by the Charter as provisional and temporary until Security Council takes necessary measures and until collective security comes into action, and not a substitute for it. It has been pointed out earlier that under Article 51, the right of collective self-defense exists until Security Council takes any action. Thus, it is provisional and temporary. It comes to an end as soon as the Security Council takes any action. Moreover, it should not affect the authority and responsibility of Security Council for the maintenance or restoration of international peace and security. In view of the provisions of the Charter, which I have already explained you, it is clear that the sanctions behind the collective security are much stronger than the collective self-defense. Collective self-defense is, in fact, an exception to the principle of non-intervention incorporated in Article number 2 of the United Nations Charter so far as Security Council is concerned. Article number 2 specifically provides that this principle, the principle of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of a state by the United Nations. This point is also very important. I repeat it again, that the principle of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of a state by the United Nations. This principle is very important principle of the United Nations. So, this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under chapter number 7. It must, however, be admitted that because of the conflict among permanent members, the system of collective security has failed to achieve the desired objectives. Because of the exercise of veto power, Security Council failed to fulfill the primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. Due to the failure of the Security Council to fulfill the responsibility entrusted to it under the Charter, the General Assembly assumed certain powers in the field of international peace and security by the Uniting for Peace resolution. But if we quote here, Congo experience has shown that even for the successful functioning of the General Assembly in this field, unanimity among major power is essential. So, different arguments, different assumptions, different provisions of the Charter. For the successful collective security system, it is very necessary that superpowers played their important role in a serious way to maintain international peace and security. So, if we analyze successful and successful measures through collective security system, effectiveness of the collective security system, then we find out that it is very necessary that all superpowers played their important role for the betterment of states, for the maintenance of peaceful and cooperative relations among states. While analyzing successfulness and effectiveness of the collective security system, then we find out that the arguments in favor of the system are based on incomplete assumptions. First, an essential assumption is the absolute irresponsibility of the major states. Collective security system, in the collective security system, role of states, effective role of major states, permanent states, veto power states is very important. There are many difficulties which can be experienced in determining the collectively different methods for application, which explained in the United Nations Charter, can be fulfilled only and only through the role of members of the United Nations and the high expectations of collective security system, particularly post Second World War period. United Nations played its vital role in different cases, and that role cannot be denied, because the importance of United Nations collective security system cannot be denied in different aspects. If we analyze United Nations system, then we find out that United Nations provides three pillars for the maintenance of peace, peaceful change, and the pacific settlement of international dispute. First of all, states tried their best for the utilization of pacific settlement of disputes, and then peaceful change, and then collective security measures. The idea of collective security is that by pooling their strength and collectively played their important role in the Security Council and in the system of the United Nations, all will cooperate in controlling or disturb of the peace. They will act as one for all and all for one. While this point is very, very important, and you can very easily understand basic theme, basic concept of the system of collective security under the United Nations, that all members act as one is for all and all for one. Their combined power will serve as guarantee of the security of each in the face of such overwhelming strength. So, every nation will fulfill its international obligations as explained in the Charter of the United Nations. The use of peaceful methods also will be stimulated. Greater trust among nations also will be created in aggression will cease as and different levels relations of the states can be maintained in a proper way. So it means general cooperative action for the maintenance and enforcement of international peace. Collective security system is based on the principle that conflict among the members of the community affects the whole community, and unilateral violence against a member is crime against all the members. So, under these circumstances, the idea is to maintain peace, which is inherent of the basis of every political community. I have already explained you in midterm syllabus uh, with the reference of the League of the Nation. With the reference of the League of the Nation, I also explained you collective security system under the League of the Nation, and with the discussion of the League of the Nation, I have already explained you that role of states played very important and significant in the success of every system of the collective measures, peaceful settlement, negotiations, and for the betterment of relations among nations for the promotion of peace and security. I conclude my discussion that collective security system under the United Nations and according to the Charter of the United Nations, basic purpose of this system always remain to maintain international peace and security and to work for the betterment of the states for a peaceful world. And that is the end of our today's discussion. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Our next discussion is about Korean War. I have already explained you in previous lecture about the theory, about the provisions, about the concept of collective security system under the United Nations, and now I explain you about Korean War with the special reference of United Nations collective security system. After the Second World War, the Korean War was the first major war. For the first time, United Nations militia came into action against the aggressor state after Second World War, or rather in 1945, Russia had occupied North Korea while South Korea was under the occupation of American forces. The American forces withdrew from the held territory, making South Korea a democratic country under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, while the Russian established the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea. The dividing line between the two Korean was the 38 parallel. The situation remained peaceful till 1950, but in 1950 a sudden war broke out between the two Koreans. It is really very difficult to assess the immediate cause of war. Neither it is possible to say truly who was the actual aggressor. Anyway, United Nations or the world opinion regarded Communist Korea to be the aggressor, while the North Korea claimed that the South Korean government's armed forces crossed the 38th parallel. First, Soviet Foreign Minister said that the events in Korea were the result of a premeditated, planned, and unprovoked attack by South Korean troops on the frontier areas of the Korean People's Democratic Republic. So, it is impossible to trace the real aggressor. Security Council. Now I explain you about Security Council resolutions regarding this conflicting situation or situation of war. The Korean War started on the 25th of June 1950. Immediately, the United States reported the matter to the Secretary General. The United States explained that the North Korean had invaded South Korea, which constituted a breach of peace and an act of aggression. The Security Council met the same day and passed a resolution calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities and called upon the authorities of North Korea to withdraw their armed forces to the 38 parallel. The next day, the United Nations Commission for Korea was reported. United Nations Commission for Korea reported that the North Korean advances had created a dangerous situation. On June 27th, the Security Council in its resolution regretted non-compliance of its resolution by North Korea and called on big powers to resist North Korean aggression. United Nations forces defend South Korea. In fact, the United States was very keenly interested to check communist advance in the Far East. Immediately, US Air Force and Navy was dispatched to help Bree's government. US 7th Fleet was ordered to protect Formosa, and Formosa was asked to meanwhile cease all hostilities against the mainland. A unified military command was established under the United Nations flag to resist the communist armies. In this situation, another development occurred that China immediately entered her forces to the North Korea, and it was estimated that not less than 7 lakh Chinese were fighting on the side of North Korea. These Chinese forces were equipped with modern weapons supplied by Russia. Russian planes were sent in large numbers to destroy South Korea. So both the sides were prepared for a war. The war dragged on with no decisive victories to either party. Sometimes the North Korean could penetrate far into the same position into the South Korea. Other times the South Korean appeared in the same position in North Korea. Meanwhile, different attempts were being made in the United Nations for a ceasefire to control the war, to stop the war. On January 11, 1951, Unified Command made the following proposals for ceasefire. Number 1. A ceasefire should be arranged with the safeguard that it would not be used for mounting a new offensive. Number 2. All non-Korean armed forces should be withdrawn by appropriate stages and appropriate arrangements in accordance with United Nations principles should be made for the Korean people to express their own free will in respect of their future government. Against these proposals, China made counter proposals. Number 1, negotiation should be held among the countries concerned. Number 2, the subject matter of the negotiations must include the withdrawal of the United States armed forces from Formosa. Number 3, the 7 countries to participate in the negotiations should be China, USSR, UK, USA, France, India and Egypt, and the rightful place of the people's government in the United Nations should be established as from the beginning of the conference. The 7-nation conference should be held in China at a place to be selected. Peace negotiations started in June 1951 at Panmunjom. On June 8, 1953, agreement was reached on the prisoners of war issue. A neutral nations reparations commission composed of Czechoslovakia, India, Poland, Sweden and Switzerland was to conduct the repatriation of prisoners of war. India was to act as in chairman. The commission was asked to finish its work within 90 days. Thus, a major hurdle was that to stop the violation of disputed parties. Then the armistice agreement was also concluded on July 1953, which was signed by the Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command with the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers. In accordance with the terms of the agreement, hostilities ceased on July 27, 1953, and the armistice agreement became effective through the United Nations arrangement. The 38th parallel remained the dividing line between the two Koreans. Thus ended the most futile war of this post-war world. Neither party gained anything. It was decided by the United Nations that its observers will stay in Korea and to watch the implementations of the armistice agreement under the United Nations. And later on, free elections under the supervision of the United Nations will be held in both the Koreas in order to pave way to the Korean unity. But so far, elections have not been organized. The United Nations forces still in the South Korea, while Chinese forces are equally ready in the north. Overall, situation in Korea is although not explosive, but at the same time it has not been satisfactorily solved. During this discussion, one point is very important, and that is about division of the Korea. In present scenario, South Korea and North Korea also playing their own role, their own regions. One point is very clear, that the Korean War was actually war between a capitalist bloc in the leadership of American and communist bloc under the communism philosophy. It was actually a war between East and West, a war between two big powers, two blocs, East and West, and both supported clearly for their own vested interest of their ideologies. Korean War and collective security system of the United Nations only played its role for ceasefire, for the expansion of hostilities. All hostilities ceased for the time being, but still North and South Korea are backed by two superpowers, United States of America and Russia, and North Korea by Russia and by China. So, our conclusion, our concluding remarks are: collective security system become helpful to stop the war between two Koreans, North and South. United Nations collective security system played very important role for the maintenance of international peace and security through different through the formulation of different commissions, through the use of force, and through the negotiations, and overall United Nations role and collective security systems importance cannot be denied. And that is the end of our today's discussion. One point which I have already discussed, that during the study of United Nations system, controversies, conflicting situations of superpowers always played their very important role. And that is the